Welcome back, everybody, to a brand new series that we'll be reacting to on Extra History. You guys can't seem to get enough of their videos. They've been the most popular reaction videos that I've been doing lately. So I thought I would dive into another one that is right in my wheelhouse as far as stuff that I'm interested in and passionate about and have spent a lot of time studying, and that is the history of medieval England. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next coming days. We also will be doing some other things as well. And if you want to see more original content on this channel and you want to have a direct hand in supporting the creation of original content on this channel, we are planning some trips in the near future as soon as COVID clears up to the UK, to Western Europe. And all of the funds that are raised, not only through the GoFundMe that was set up by the mods, the link's in the description for that, but also through Patreon. And we have over 50 patrons now on this channel. All of the money raised through Patreon is going to go directly into my travel fund to support me going to these places to make original content to take you along for those journeys. So if you want to support that and you want to have an ability to get some custom merch that is available to our patrons at certain levels, as well as have a say in future content as far as the reaction videos go, that's all available to our patrons through Patreon. So check that out through the link in the description, and you'll have a direct responsibility for the content of this channel, both through reaction videos and through original content through historic site videos. Check that out today. We're going to dive into Extra History's history of medieval England, and let's go ahead and just start right into part one.
The 100 Years' War. The pageants and tournaments of chivalry, knights in burnished armour, the English archer destroying the flower of French chivalry, the great battles of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, or just a sign of the brutality of the Middle Ages, senseless warfare and destruction, the death of thousands in the mud of France for nothing more than the greed and ambition of kings. There's all of this and more in the 100 Years' War. It's a story of courage, the clash of nations, a story of human endeavour and the timeless struggle for supremacy. Yet there's also another story here, the story of a war that helped define England, her sense of herself, her language, her role in the world. The 100 Years' War helped form a nation. Welcome to the Extra History of England.
So you have to remember that going all the way back to the time of William the Conqueror in 1066, there have been these familial ties and claims between England and France. England is largely French at this point in history. Their first language at the court is French. Most of the descent of the nobility is from France, and that all goes back to when the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, conquers England and overthrows the Anglo-Saxon and also Viking or Danish kings that have ruled England back and forth. And so now you've got this French influx, and because you've got a French king in England, you've got him also controlling large parts of England, and then that of course gets even stronger with Eleanor of Aquitaine bringing in that part of France. And so large parts of France are controlled by the English kings. And I believe starting with Edward III, there was a real strong claim on the French throne by the English kings. And for hundreds of years, English kings actually called themselves King of France as well. And so all of this plays into the roots of why you get a 100 Years' War.
It's 1328. The new King of England is a young man called Edward III. But he's powerless, because his mother's lover, a man named Roger Mortimer, had seized control of his throne.
So there's a reason why all of this happens, and it goes back to, if you've watched Braveheart, despite all of the historical inaccuracies, you're at least probably familiar with Edward I, Longshanks they call him. He's also known as Hammer of the Scots. Well, Edward I, his son is Edward II, and when Edward II takes the throne, Edward II is the total polar opposite of his father. His father was a strong, kind of a really big dude, a strong, powerful ruler. Edward II is the exact opposite of that. He's quite possibly either bisexual or homosexual. He has this relationship with this guy, Piers Gaveston, who eventually gets executed himself. And so Edward's very ineffective as a ruler, and his wife, Isabella, eventually takes the throne from Edward II with her lover, Roger Mortimer. They usurp the throne from Edward II. Edward is thrown into prison, dies in prison under mysterious circumstances. There's a lot of speculation about how that happened. But then they've got a son, Edward III, who is the rightful heir to the throne, but has to take the throne that's rightfully his from his mother and her lover. And it's really cool how that happens. It involves like sneaking into the castle in the middle of the night, and it's a fascinating story.
But Edward was a warrior and a leader of men. In 1330, at the age of only 17, he gathered some friends and by pale moonlight snuck into Mortimer's castle. He cut down the guards and seized Mortimer himself. The interloper was dragged through the jeering crowds of London, dragged to the gallows known as the Tyburn Tree, where countless traitors would die over the centuries and hung by the neck until dead.
Now, having him hanged at Tyburn, that's usually something that was done for people of low birth. Roger Mortimer was the Earl of March. He was nobility, but he wasn't executed like a noble. A nobleman was usually beheaded, usually at the Tower. So to have him hanged at Tyburn was an insult that said you are not of noble birth. You don't deserve to die like nobles. But interestingly, Roger Mortimer ends up the ancestor, beginning, I think, he's the ancestor of Edward IV and of Richard III. He's kind of the ancestor of the Yorkist claims to the throne, and therefore is the ancestor of every monarch of England, starting with Henry VIII, and on the way down after that.
From that point, Edward was determined that England and his royal court would be a shining example of culture to all Christendom. The court of the young king was a pageant of colour, music, tournaments and poetry. He surrounded himself with the enormously wealthy nobility and modelled his court on the glory of the ancient and mythical Camelot, of King Arthur, a celebration of the cult of chivalry. But part of that cult was that the king would lead his nobles to war, wealth and glory. And while at times the nobility did strain against the king's authority, for the most part they were his natural allies, holding their lands from him and working with him to govern his kingdom and his people. And so, with his greatest nobles at his side, Edward did what he loved most and was born for. He led his nobility to war and crushed the Scots in battle. But then in 1337, Edward's world was threatened. The French were at the gates. Well, not the literal gates. Actually, it's a complex dynastic claim involving several hundred years of medieval inheritance, law and international politics.
Yep.
We should be able to cover that in just a few sentences. For centuries, the French and English royal dynasties had fought over land in France. In the blue corner, the French royal dynasty, the Valois. And in the red corner, the English royal dynasty, the Plantagenets.
Who were French, by the way. Not only are they descended from William the Conqueror, but then the Plantagenet dynasty comes in through a guy named Geoffrey Plantagenet, who was the Count of Anjou, who marries Matilda, who's the Empress of England at that time. Well, they call her Empress because she had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor before that, but Matilda was a direct descendant of and the heir to the claim on the throne of William the Conqueror. So when she marries Geoffrey Plantagenet, now their children, starting with their son Henry, are Plantagenet kings. And the Plantagenet dynasty goes all the way through to Richard III.
And the Valois king of France, King Philip VI of France, was determined to take the last of Edward's French lands away from him. Because medieval kingdoms didn't follow modern borders or rules. They were the property of a king and his nobles. English claims in France went all the way back to 1066, when a French noble called William the Bastard decided that he deserved more than the lands he held in Normandy. He made the most of a distant claim to the English throne, sailed across the Channel, beat up the English and became known to history as William the Conqueror. The old Anglo-Saxon landowners were swept away, and England became the property of French-speaking lords. French was the language of the nobility, of literature, of the king's court. English was the language of the peasant and the serf. Fast forward 100 years, and in 1155, a young man called Henry became King Henry II of England. Henry came from Anjou in France, and so more French land was added to those holdings in Normandy that came from old Billy the Conk.
So this is what happens when I'm reacting to something I've never seen before. I just told you everything that they've just gone over, so my apologies for you getting that twice, but I didn't know they were going to talk about all that.
Plus, Henry then married the richest heiress in Europe, always a good way of paying the bills, the powerful, cultured and intelligent Eleanor of Aquitaine. And she brought even more French land to the English crown. Henry and his successors, the Plantagenet royal family, now owned almost half of modern France, They spoke French, they loved France, they were French. If they had to choose between a croissant and a full English breakfast, it'd be the croissant every time. But there's a catch. Most of these lands were in theory still owned by the kings of France. Like all medieval vassals, everyone with lands in France was supposed to kneel and pay homage to the Valois kings for them.
So it's kind of a unique thing about how this all works, that you have a guy who's king in England, but is also at the same time a vassal to the French king because of the territory that he owns in France. So being the king, you can simultaneously be king of England, but also Duke of Aquitaine or Count of Anjou, and have to pay homage to the French king for those lands, not for your English lands, but for those other lands. And it just adds one more layer of complication to all of this.
In practice, though, the likes of Billy the Conk and Henry II were simply too powerful to be forced to do what the Valois told them to do. So they just paid lip service to the French king's theoretical rights and got on with the party. But over the centuries, bit by bit, the Valois had used their rights to take back most of that land while weaker Plantagenets were on the English throne. By the time Edward III was born, most of those lands had been successfully reclaimed by the French, leaving only a single province left in English hands, a place called Gascony. The Valois king, Philip VI, was determined to take that last province away from the Plantagenets and England. Philip had no doubt he could achieve this. After all, France was the most powerful and glorious country in all Christendom. It was one of the leading centres of culture and learning. Philip only counted as his equals the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and that's it. England was just a small, damp and slightly grubby country somewhere in the North Sea. The French nobility were the shining exemplar of chivalry, while the English nobility were not. Philip made trouble for Edward. He made an alliance with the Scots against the English, and then at his court in 1337 he formally confiscated Gascony. Edward tried to talk. Philip told him to talk to the hand. Edward told him to talk to the edge of his sword. He would defend his rights. The confiscation was not just an insult to Edward, it was also a threat to English merchants. England had two great sources of wealth. One was in the wine trade with Gascony. The Gascon merchants as well as the English hated the idea of losing the wine trade with England. Even more important, though, was the wool trade, with the county of Flanders in the modern-day Belgium.
And you notice that both of these sources of wealth for the English are on the European continent. They're not in England itself. So this is why England is constantly going to war on the mainland, trying to hold on to these lands.
The textile industry was far and away the biggest industry in medieval Europe other than agriculture. No other industry was a fraction of its value. And the textile industry was dominated by the densely populated towns of northern Italy and Flanders. English wool fed that trade. English wool was the best in all Europe, finer, with longer strands making it easier to turn into yarn and creating the softest, strongest woolen cloth. Every year, thousands of huge wool sacks were sold to Flemish merchants, and every year customs dues from the trade filled the English treasury. But the Count of Flanders was a subject of the French king, and now King Philip told Flanders they could no longer trade with the English. The Flemish were as horrified as the English. Without English wool, their industry would die and their people would starve.
So it's also fascinating if you think about the history after this, all the way up to the present day. World War I, for example, Napoleonic Wars. You have this constant use of trade and restricting trade as a way of controlling what's happening. Cutting off the sources for buying English wool is a big deal. Napoleon talked about the continental system and trying to starve England by not letting them trade. Germany got blockaded during World War I to keep them from being able to trade with the rest of the world. Trade is a constant source of regulating and controlling diplomacy and war.
So one Friday, in the bustling market square in Ghent in Flanders, the people gathered excitedly round a wooden stage. It was covered with colourful pennants and flags. But they saw a new flag, the arms of England quartered with the royal arms of France, and they wondered what that could mean. A young, powerful man stepped forward. His name, he declared, was King Edward III. He had been wrongfully banned from his lands in France, and he would reclaim his right. The people cheered. But there was more. By the right of his French mother, he was claiming the very throne of France itself. The Flemish cheered. The French giggled. War was now unstoppable.
So it was a pretty legit claim. It wasn't just some, kind of farcical thing that Edward was claiming. His mother was the sister of the King of France. And the King of France, I believe, had died out without any legit heirs, like descendant heirs. And so the throne actually passed to a more distant relative. And so Edward was claiming that he was the next in line to the throne because he was the son of the eldest sibling of the previous king. So what ends up happening is that you have the guy who comes to the throne in France instead, who has a more distant claim. Over the next couple of decades, he gets people to kind of rework the laws in France to make it so that only direct male lines could inherit. So therefore, Edward couldn't inherit the throne through a female, his mother. It had to go through another male line. But that was not a law that was in place at the time. It was something that was kind of backtracked to keep Edward from having a claim to the throne during the 100 Years' War.
At stake on the English side was trade, the English role in Christendom, the king's lands in France held by right for 150 years, and the reputation and honour of the king. On the French side, a unified country, national prestige, and the right of their monarch to his throne. So join us next time as these two great kings marshal their forces and the 100 Years' War begins in earnest.
All right, so we're going to stop right there. There's a lot more to be covered, not only about the 100 Years' War, but other parts of English history. If this is something that you don't know a lot about, I hope you'll stick around and maybe learn some things along the way. I hope this will inspire you to want to go and read for yourself and learn some things. Dan Jones has a fantastic book called The Plantagenets that I've read several times. It's really, really good and gives you a lot of the history of what's going on in this time. Edward III is one of my favorite characters to study because he not only deals with the 100 Years' War, he deals with a massive outbreak, one of the most deadly outbreaks of the plague in world history, right in the middle of his reign. He's on the throne for a long, long time, and it's after his death that you have everything fall apart and lead to the Wars of the Roses. So it's a fascinating time in history. I hope you'll stick around for that. If you have something to add to what we've talked about, use the comment section below. Don't forget to check out the links that I mentioned earlier, Patreon, GoFundMe, and be watching for other original content coming in the near future. Thanks for watching.